The AP biology curriculum includes two of the human body systems that are involved in communication. And the reason they do that is sort of as an extension of cell signaling and cell communication. So we're going to actually spend quite a bit of time here going through the endocrine system and the nervous system. The reason we're going to spend a decent amount of time is just because these are complicated systems, and so I want to make sure that you do understand them. But typically they are used for examples and things of that nature when it comes to cell signaling, and in the case of the nervous system, a lot of times also exchange of materials across the membrane. So we're going to take a look at how the body uses chemical signaling in the endocrine system. And the primary job here is sort of the function of your metabolism, the regulation of homeostasis, and your body's response to stimuli in the environment around you. So, as I said starting out, you really have two communication and control systems in your body. Major responsibility of these two systems are to work together to maintain homeostasis. And so homeostasis, kind of just taking for granted that you guys remember that term, meaning sort of like balance in the body. And these systems are the endocrine system and the nervous system. Now, the endocrine system involves discrete organs or glands, like you see in this picture, and we'll talk about these, which secrete hormones, which are these chemical signals that released by one cell, circulate in the bloodstream, and then bind with other cells to cause some sort of reaction. And these are involved in, like I mentioned before, metabolism, but also growth and behavior and reproduction, and all sorts of things. Now, your nervous system is a little bit different, right? Your nervous system is a number of neurons, which transmit signals both sort of in a chemical way, but also in technically an electrical way. And so that'll be the subject of another set of notes that we'll tack onto these later. A quick review of intercellular signaling. This showed up previously in our class, so I just wanted to actually look at the same pictures again and touch on these terms, which then leads us right to endocrine. So remember, paracrine signaling is a secretion that just goes to nearby cells. So it's just in the same kind of general tissue area. Autocrine signaling, think auto to self. So this is where the cell actually releases something that comes back and binds with that cell and causes a reaction, which seems kind of silly, but is functional in some cases. And then synaptic signaling we'll get into more soon when it involves neurons. And so this is where a neuron makes a connection with another tissue or another nerve cell. And the way that it does this is by releasing a chemical called a neurotransmitter, right, into this space called the synapse, which is this tiny space right between the neuron here and the cell, what we call the target cell that it's working on. And so at the end of that neuron, the signal becomes a chemical signal that then passes on to the next cell. Now then this takes us to endocrine signaling. And we mentioned this briefly before, but obviously we're going to get a lot more deeply into it now. And then also add a second wrinkle that you see on this slide too. Also, I failed to mention so far in this, these couple PowerPoints show you my love of baby memes, and then my obsession with making my own memes out of my children. My wife now knows basically if I take a picture of the kids, there's a really good chance that I'm going to turn it into a meme on my phone as well. And so I've peppered some of those in here that I've made or that I think are particularly funny. So endocrine signaling, right? Endocrine is where, again, a hormone is secreted or released into the bloodstream, and it will travel potentially long distances to a target cell. That's the difference between endocrine and the things on the last slide, is that endocrine could be released up in your head and have an effect on tissues in your feet. They can travel anywhere that your bloodstream can take them. And they're going to help maintain homeostasis. They're going to help you respond to the environment, as we said before, and they're going to be involved in growth, development, and energy metabolism. This plays into the body's response to stress and all sorts of different things that go on in the body. Now, we also have what's called neuroendocrine signaling. Neuroendocrine signaling is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a combination of nervous and endocrine signaling, and it involves these unique cells called neurosecretory cells. And these are nervous system cells found within the brain that release a neurohormone into your bloodstream. So typically we talk about endocrine cells or endocrine glands that release hormones. Here we're talking about a nervous cell, a neuron that can release a hormone. And so an example of this, we're not going to get into it too deeply or anything. There's one called ADH, or Antidiuretic Hormone. Your body, or your brain, will release this, which will affect how your kidneys work and how you maintain water in your systems. Like I said, I'm a little addicted to this. I think this is one of my favorite pictures of my kids all time, when Eric was a baby. There's just so many good pieces to this, Charlotte. This very just raw emotion of being exasperated with her baby brother, and he just doesn't really understand why. And she's also wearing an Elsa dress randomly over her clothes, and it's just fantastic. And there's like this dead stuffed animal in the background. And then this one was one of Eric's first Easter outfits, which I was just a big fan of. But my brother, sometimes my kids actually call my brother, whose name is Michael, they call him Uncle Dew, because he always has Diet Mountain Dew basically on him at all times. Eric still does not call my brother that all the time, but if you show Eric a Mountain Dew bottle, he calls it Uncle Dew, even though he could easily say Mountain Dew today. And so it was never strange to see the kids also playing with my brother's Diet Mountain Dew bottles when they were little and stuff too. And then this one's from vacation. This one has a fantastic story that goes with it. Basically just, Eric was wearing a swim diaper, as I think here he was maybe about to turn 2 years old, and he had been playing around so much he had all this kind of sand in it, so he started complaining because it was so uncomfortable with sand inside the diaper. So my wife was like, what do we do? And I was like, just take it off of him, he's fine. And we had him under this canopy and stuff. Well, we look up and he's taken off, and he's like standing with these other people at their little beach setup, just kind of chit-chatting with them with no pants on at all. And so I had to run him down, and it was a good story. And then we got this great picture out of it too. And then this is the most recent meme that I've created, which is from a department meeting we had, I guess a week or two ago now. But there's just so many good things in this picture, including Dr. Wong's half smile, which is his typical sort of thing when there's a picture, and Mr. and Miss Bowman, sitting in the same house in different rooms on the feed with us, and that sort of thing. It was a good time. So then here we have little similar pictures that go with endocrine signaling and neuroendocrine signaling again. Endocrine signaling, you've got your endocrine cell, and then these target cells might be far away in the bloodstream. And then with the neuroendocrine, you don't start with an endocrine cell, you actually start with this neurosecretory cell. Also, one last kind of signaling, and I just bring it up now because we've brought it up a couple times this year, and that's pheromone signaling, right? And that's where your cells actually will release or secrete a chemical into the external environment, so outside the body. And we've mentioned this a couple times, like with behavior, pretty well understood area of science when it comes to insects. Not as well understood in humans, and we mentioned that sweaty t-shirt test, I think, before, where it's almost as though humans have the ability to sense a pheromone and be able to tell if a person would be attractive to them or not. Just a weird concept to even think about being able to process pheromones in our mind. Now, in your body, you have some actual endocrine organs, quote unquote, or endocrine glands. In other cases, you have endocrine cells found within an organ who might have another job as well, right? So for instance, your stomach, right? The primary job of your stomach is to digest food or begin the digestion process of the food you intake. But the stomach actually has some endocrine cells that do release hormones that are involved in whether you feel hungry or whether you feel full or things like that. The liver releases hormones, the kidneys, as it says here, release hormones. But again, that not necessarily the primary job of that organ, but they have some endocrine cells. Now, endocrine glands are strictly endocrine organs, meaning their primary job in your body is to release a hormone that helps with one of these kind of communication systems. And so you've got a number of endocrine glands actually up in your cranium with your brain, including the hypothalamus, pineal, and pituitary. You've got thyroid glands in your neck, which we'll talk more about later on in a little more detail. You've got what's called the parathyroids, which are stuck on the back of your thyroid gland. You've got the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of the kidneys, hence the term adrenal. You've got your pancreas, which we'll talk a little bit more about later too. And then you've got ovaries or testes, kind of those reproductive organs, are endocrine glands. So in this picture, you've got the major endocrine glands here on the right, on the left, and you've got these kind of accessory organs that also have endocrine function here on the right. Now, a question that I've gotten in the past is, what is a gland? And it's a really good question, so I made a slide about that, right? A gland is technically just a term for an organ that's made up almost entirely of secretory or secretory cells, meaning made up almost entirely of cells that release chemicals. So you can kind of think of it like a gland is made up of a whole bunch of cells that are basically just bags that can sort of squirt out something, right? Some kind of chemical. Now, there's really two types of glands in your body, and the word roots can help you here. You've got endocrine glands, which secrete hormones into the extracellular space, but those hormones are going to then travel throughout the internal area of the body. And you've got exocrine glands, which have ducts. And so these exocrine glands will carry their secretions to an external surface or a cavity. So again, endocrine glands, good examples, the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are found, again, sort of on top of your kidneys. Adrenal glands release a number of hormones, but one of the most talked about ones is epinephrine or adrenaline. We'll come back to that one here in a minute too, to give you more detail about that. And then exocrine glands, you can think of things like your salivary glands, right? Kind of tucked in your mouth, and they're going to secrete things, saliva that moves through a duct and then is released into your mouth, so that external area. Sweat glands, same thing, right? These are glands that are embedded in your skin, have a little duct or a little tube up to the skin surface so they can release their sweat on that external surface. And then you've got glands that can do both. And pretty much we're just talking about the pancreas here. But the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine function. So the exocrine pancreas secretes digestive hormones into your gut, which I know is inside your body, but technically that's sort of an outside surface. And then the endocrine pancreas is a thing that most of you are probably familiar with, is able to secrete insulin and a couple other hormones which help regulate blood sugar levels. And so we'll talk about that a little more later in these notes too. Now, if we look at hormones for just a moment, this is going to be super quick because I don't think this will be that important for us. Hormones can vary, but they pretty much come in three types. We've got proteins or polypeptide hormones. These are water soluble, so they do not pass easily through membranes. They're typically going to attach to surface receptors. And this would be things like the insulin we just mentioned or HGH, human growth hormone. The second possibility is a steroid. A steroid is really a lipid, right? It's a modified fat. It's actually a modified cholesterol. That's this kind of structure right here looks a lot like cholesterol. But we add a little bit of a modification to it and we get a hormone, in this case called cortisol. Now these are lipid soluble, so they do pass through membranes easily and tend to bind to intracellular receptors, so receptors inside the cell. And this includes cortisol from this picture, which is one of the other hormones released by your adrenal glands, or also like estrogen, testosterone. The third possibility is the amines. Amines are pretty much just what they sound like. They're amino acids. These are very small hormones. These can be lipid soluble or water soluble. So if they're lipid soluble, they might go inside the cell, like you see here. If they're water soluble, they most likely bind to an external receptor. And so epinephrine would be this first example here in this picture. Thyroxine, which is one of your thyroid hormones, would be this other picture here. Now, you've got a video break here, which is probably my favorite one of the year. I've probably said that before, but I do enjoy Key and Peele. If anybody ever watched that, there's a lot there that's not appropriate for school, but we watched those football player videos earlier this year, and those are probably my second favorite Key and Peele thing, second to Mr. Garvey, substitute teacher. So please definitely take some time this week to watch your video break link. And this might be something you've heard of before or seen before, but this is just absolutely hilarious to me. So it's a good break and a well-deserved break for you guys. Now what we want to get into is regulatory activity and then kind of specific examples of endocrine systems. When we talk about regulatory activity, what we're saying is, what does a particular hormone actually do at the cellular level? Because again, remember that the key here is that we're using this as an example of cell communication. So if we have a water-soluble hormone, great example of this is epinephrine, or also known as adrenaline. Now epinephrine leads to a fight or flight response, right? And for some reason, I feel like we have talked about this year, but maybe we haven't. In fact, I think maybe we did talk about it a little bit with cell signaling. But the fight or flight response, right? So epinephrine release in your body is a response to some sort of stressor. If you are walking down a dark alley and you see a scary person coming towards you, your body will execute a fight or flight response, which basically is a number of changes in the body to respond to that potential risk, right? And it will prime your body to do one of two things, right? You can choose to fight or you can choose to run. And so what epinephrine will do is cause changes throughout your body that will help you to do those things. So for instance, and we'll come back to this in a minute, epinephrine will help divert blood flow and therefore oxygen to your muscle tissues. So that makes your muscles actually a little bit more ready to either fight or allow you to run, right? Now, the question we need to answer, though, is how does it do this from a cellular standpoint? And so epinephrine, being water soluble, has to bind to a cell surface receptor. So I hope this looks a little familiar, right? These guys are going to bind to one of these G protein coupled receptors. G protein coupled receptors will then activate a G protein, right? A G protein will then lead to signal transduction. And so we have reception, we trigger a signal transduction cascade, and then we get to some sort of cytoplasmic response, right? So just remember, when we talk about cell signaling, we're talking about reception, transduction, response. So in the case of epinephrine in particular, right, epinephrine is going to be released by the adrenal gland in response to stress. It is going to move through your circulatory system to different tissues in your body, right? And at those different tissues, it's going to do different jobs. So if we focus just on the liver, right, epinephrine is going to go to the liver where it will do what you see in this picture. All right, it will bind to a G protein coupled receptor, activate the G protein. In this case, we got this other guy we've talked about before, the second messenger system, right? So it activates adenylyl cyclase, which increases cyclic AMP levels. That binds to this thing called protein kinase A, and then notice what it does in the liver, right? Epinephrine inhibits glycogen synthesis. That's like the storage, right? And promotes glycogen breakdown. So what this is going to do is increase free energy for cells. Right? So whatever your cells might do to help you fight or flight, the liver is going to allow more access to sugar or energy to do those things. Now, on the other hand, if we talk about those lipid-soluble hormones, right? Lipid-soluble hormones can, if here's my cell, they can pass right through the membrane, right? So they're going to go find an internal receptor. And in this case, we usually end up with a nuclear response, right? We got binding to an internal receptor. We've got some sort of signal transduction that probably leads us also into the nucleus, and then we get a change in gene expression. So as you mentioned before, estrogens and testosterone are lipid-soluble. The thyroid hormones are lipid-soluble, and they're going to make their way into the cell and into the nucleus, where they're going to do different things. So in this case, estrogen is going to increase expression of different sex genes. Thyroid hormones are going to increase expression of different metabolic enzymes. So you guys may have known that kind of in general already, that the thyroid's involved in your metabolism, and so we'll come back to that shortly. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, one of the most important things about hormones that you want to keep in mind is that they are going to have different effects on different tissues. So they're going to be released from that endocrine gland, and then where they bind, right, where they are received, can lead to all different kinds of reactions. Now, typically, these reactions are parallel type things, right? They all help contribute to a similar full body response, but they're just going to happen a little differently in different tissues. So if we go back to our epinephrine example again, we mentioned before that at the liver, epinephrine will lead to the breakdown of glycogen, so we're going to increase free energy. But epinephrine will also bind with blood vessels to skeletal muscles and allow them to dilate. So it will increase blood flow to skeletal muscle, right? The muscle you would use to run or to fight or something. But the epinephrine will bind to blood vessels of the digestive tract and cause them to constrict and decrease blood flow. Because the reality is, if you're in a situation where you need to run, you do not need to be digesting your food, right? And so these different effects can occur in different tissues because of slightly different receptors, and different signaling transduction pathways within the cell. As a fun side note, this right here is why they suggest that you shouldn't swim for an hour after you eat. uh, it's not that, don't tell your parents I said this. It's not that you can't get in a pool right after you eat. The concern is you don't want to like try to go out into the ocean right after you eat, or try to get into a really deep pool or take part in a big race. And the reason is because you'll confuse your systems, right? So let's say you are out in the ocean and you just ate. Well, after you eat, your body is trying to send blood to your digestive tract to digest your food. But if you start to swim hard and fight some waves in the ocean, you're going to actually release some adrenaline and you're going to start to try to divert that blood to your muscles. So a couple things can happen, right? Your stomach might cramp up because it's trying to digest the foods, but your skeletal muscles might also cramp up. And again, if you're out in the open ocean and you start to cramp up because of that, it's conceivable that you could actually drown. Now, the same is really true for any kind of activity, right? Like you probably shouldn't play a volleyball game or run a cross-country meet for a while after you eat. But we don't usually talk about that because, the volleyball court probably won't kill you like the ocean could kill you if you start to cramp up. Now, I also just want to point out briefly that local regulators do matter too, right? Sometimes hormonal responses in the body actually aren't the result of hormones. They're the result of those paracrine signals, right? Those really local signals. We mentioned cytokines in the immune system, right? Released by immune system cells, and those serve to increase the immune response. Growth factors we have mentioned this year a couple different times. They are usually released by a cell and go to a cell very nearby. But they will help to stimulate growth and division. Really important in stimulating healing of bone and other tissues that you might damage. And then nitric oxide is an interesting case. Nitric oxide is the only gaseous human hormone. It's actually released by the walls of your blood vessels. And what this does is if oxygen is detected as sort of appearing at low levels, your blood vessels will release nitric oxide and the surrounding blood vessel tissues will relax or dilate, which will increase blood flow to tissues. And so I put this in here. Who would have thought that I could bring up Viagra twice in a year in AP Biology? But what Viagra actually does is leads to nitric oxide release. And so dilation of blood vessels and increased blood flow to reproductive tissues. Now, I also threw this in here. I think this is an interesting thing to kind of know. You may have heard of prostaglandins before. Prostaglandins are these kind of modified fatty acids that are found in your bloodstream. Prostaglandins do a lot of different things for your body. They are local signals, right? They're paracrine signals that are released by some cells and affect nearby cells. They are actually involved a lot in childbirth. So they trigger smooth muscle contraction that helps basically the uterus to expel the baby. At the very beginning, when we're talking about conception, it actually causes smooth muscle contraction that helps get sperm to egg for fertilization to occur as well. Prostaglandins actually promote blood clotting. I put on here both good and bad, right? So clotting when you need to stop bleeding, but also clotting in people who don't want that to show up. But two other things that I want to focus on here are these two, right? That prostaglandins will promote fever and inflammation in the immune system. So you actually see high levels of prostaglandins when you're sick. And prostaglandins also have this other kind of strange job, which is that they help protect your stomach. They help develop this protective lining that you keep in your stomach all the time. Now, why this is all interesting is I think it's a fantastic example of why medical science can be really tough, right? Because prostaglandins do all these things. So if we mess with prostaglandin levels, we might get a desired result, but we might also get what we would call side effects, right? So for instance, right, doctors recommend for some people that if you are at risk for heart attack or just clots, right, you take a daily aspirin. Now, aspirin is an anti-inflammatory drug, right? One of the things that aspirin does is it reduces prostaglandin levels. But that means that if you take an aspirin every day to try to keep your blood from clotting, right, and maybe reduce some inflammation or things like that, you're also going to mess with this bottom node. You're going to mess with that protective lining of your stomach. So you may have heard before that aspirin can bother your stomach, as can Tylenol and ibuprofen if taken too much. Several years ago, my dad had a weird thing going on. He actually ended up in the hospital a little bit. Nobody could quite figure out what was up, and as it turned out, he had a bleeding ulcer in his stomach, and that ulcer was probably caused by the fact that he took daily aspirin because he has a history of blood clots, and he had been having a lot of headaches and started to take a lot of Excedrin. And he wasn't taking more than what's recommended on the bottle, but it came down to almost every day he was taking aspirin to help prevent blood clots, and he was taking Excedrin for headaches. And over time, that broke down his stomach lining and gave him an ulcer. So kind of interesting how all these things can interplay. And again, a prostaglandin is just a local regulator, right? A paracrine signal for cells in the body. Now, what we want to start to look at is hormone pathways. Now, as you might expect, right, just using that word pathway indicates that this is sort of a complicated process, right? Kind of like we had metabolic pathways, right? Hormones work in pathways. And these pathways might include the nervous system. They might include just the endocrine system. They might include one hormone. They might include multiple hormones. And then almost always, they will include feedback control mechanisms that we've talked about this year. So there's so much that goes into the endocrine system that is a great example of other things we've learned: cell signaling, feedback inhibition, that sort of stuff. So when we talk about body regulation, almost everything that regulates homeostatically in the body is the result of one of two different things: either a simple endocrine pathway or a simple hormone pathway, is what we sometimes call that, or a simple neuroendocrine pathway, meaning that it would also involve your nervous system a little bit. Now, I think it's kind of funny that we call these simple because, again, they're actually kind of complex, but we're going to take a look at a couple examples of this. And basically, they're called simple because there's not a lot of branching, right? It's a pretty straight pathway, but it can be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around sometimes. All right, so let's start with a simple endocrine pathway. And actually, I do think that this will make pretty good sense to you because this is pretty logical. And again, pretty straightforward. It's got a couple steps to it, but it doesn't have all these different offshoots. It's just kind of a single stream of information here. In a simple endocrine pathway, an endocrine gland or endocrine cells will respond to a stimulus, release a hormone. The hormone will go to a target cell and lead to a response. All right, so simple pathway, right? Endocrine cells are stimulated, they release hormones. Hormones go to target cells physiologically respond. So if you look at this picture, this is an example of a simple endocrine pathway. It involves the duodenum, which would be part of the small intestine. All right, and what the small intestine has to deal with all the time. So let's think about your body for a second. When you eat something, it goes down your esophagus and it goes to your stomach here, right? And then it goes into the small intestine. And that very first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. Now, what the small intestine has to deal with all the time is acid, right? Because you probably knew, right? The stomach has a really low pH. It's very acidic. Well, everything that goes from the stomach into the duodenum is going to be really acidic, but the duodenum doesn't like that, right? The duodenum wants to try to buffer out that acidity. So it uses an endocrine pathway to do this. So the stimulus here is a low pH in the duodenum, right? Or in other words, acid that's moved from the stomach into the small intestine. Now, when this happens, you've got cells in the duodenum which secrete a hormone called secretin. So these endocrine cells release this secretin hormone into the bloodstream, right? And secretin actually goes to or travels to the pancreas. And I put a note here, this would be part of the exocrine pancreas, right? And the pancreas will release bicarbonate, which is a buffer, right? Bicarbonate technically is a little bit of a base. So again, you got a stimulus, acidic environment in the duodenum. It doesn't like that. So its endocrine cells release a hormone, secretin, which goes to a different tissue, the pancreas, which responds by releasing bicarbonate into the small intestinal area or into your gut lumen to help buffer out that acidity. Now, secondly, we've got simple neuroendocrine pathways. These are really similar to endocrine, but they begin with a stimulus that's detected by your nervous system. Right, so in this case, the stimulus is going to be detected by your nervous system, which we'll talk about more later, and then a neurosecretory cell from your brain releases a neurohormone that then, moves forward and causes a reaction in some target cells. So we'll have another example here, example of breastfeeding, which we brought up recently when we talked about the immune system as well. Now, you'll notice that I overlooked it in the previous slide, but we do have feedback here, right? There was negative feedback in the duodenal pathway. This is actually a positive feedback loop, so it's one of very rare examples of positive feedback in the human body. But what we know is that milk letdown in mothers who have just had babies, right? So milk release from the body is triggered by a baby attempting to breastfeed, right? Suckling. So this would be touching, right? So the baby touching the mother leads to or is sensed by the nervous system, right? And so we got a sensory neuron that detects this suckling behavior. The sensory neuron tells your hypothalamus and then your pituitary that this is going on, and so the pituitary releases a neurohormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin goes to smooth muscle in the breast tissue and causes milk release. And then again, this is unique because this is a positive feedback loop. So actually, milk release causes more stimulation of the hypothalamus and pituitary, and therefore more oxytocin release and more milk release from that breast tissue. I like the family circle. I think every once in a while they are funny. This was not an actual family circle cartoon. This is one that somebody messed with, but I think it's a great example of negative feedback, right? But you'll note on those last two slides that hormone pathways involve feedback control. And primarily it's usually going to be the thing we've talked about all year long since the very beginning, which is negative feedback, or sometimes referred to as feedback inhibition. Right? And what this means is that the response reduces the initial stimulus. So if we think back to a couple slides there, when the pancreas releases bicarbonate to help buffer that environment in the small intestine, that bicarbonate release feeds back and turns off the initial stimulus so that we stop releasing the endocrine hormone and we stop getting that whole deal. Now, the reason is kind of logical here that negative feedback is more common is because we're trying to promote homeostasis, right? We're trying to, if you think of it like the thermostat at your house, right? If you have your thermostat set on 70, if it goes below 70, your heat kicks on to get it back up to 70 degrees. If your house goes above 70, your air conditioner might kick on to bring it back down to 70 degrees. So we want to have this negative feedback that kind of kicks off the endocrine response to keep taking us back to whatever that quote-unquote normal state is. But as we saw with our second example on the previous slide, sometimes there is positive feedback where the ultimate response actually goes back and reinforces the stimulus or amplifies the response for a period of time. Now I want to look at a couple of specific examples of the endocrine system. Mainly we're going to take a look at the endocrine pancreas and the thyroid gland. And these are, both examples of, a pretty complicated system that I don't anticipate a lot of detailed questions about. Again, this year the AP test is so small, I don't see them spending an entire question on the specifics about your pancreas. That's just not really what the framework is. But I could certainly see some discussion of thyroid system, which is then followed by questions that are about cell signaling or homeostasis or feedback regulation or those kind of things. So we'll try to go kind of quick here because I don't think the anatomy and physiology of this is that important. It's just more to get this idea of what the cells are doing. So we mentioned before your endocrine pancreas helps control blood sugar levels, right? Blood glucose levels. So here's glucose. Here is a pancreas. It's kind of an ugly little tissue. Kind of falls apart, actually, if you are dissecting an animal or something that has a pancreas. It's just kind of this little lumpy organ found just below the stomach. I love this picture, so I went with it even though it's in Spanish, but these things sound way cooler anyways, don't they? Like, I guess pancreas looks the same, but the intestines sound way cooler in Spanish, right? The intestino grueso is the large intestine, and intestino delgado is the small intestine. But we're focused on the pancreas here, kind of tucked right around the stomach and the liver in your abdomen. In humans, you need a blood glucose concentration of around 70 to 110 milligrams for every 100 milliliters of blood that you have. And you want to keep this at normal at all times. If you have too much sugar in your bloodstream, you can actually overwhelm your tissues, particularly your nervous tissues, which will become damaged and not work as well. If you have too little sugar in your system, then organs will shut down because you don't have an energy source there. So the endocrine pancreas really functions like a thermostat in your house that I just mentioned, right? We're going to try to keep blood glucose concentration right around 70 to 110. If it gets outside that range, we need to react. Turn on the heat, turn on the AC, right, to get it back into that range. And so the pancreas has two antagonistic hormones that are involved in simple endocrine pathways that use negative feedback to keep us in this range. Now, the first of those endocrine hormones of the pancreas is called insulin. Insulin will lower blood glucose levels. So basically, you have these things called beta cells. I should probably back up. You have these areas, I need a different color. You have these areas inside your pancreas called islets of Langerhans, which is fun to say. And those islets of Langerhans are the endocrine cells. So this little pink area here is the endocrine part of your pancreas. And so you've got these beta cells, and the beta cells will release insulin when blood glucose levels are high. So like right after you eat, right? So let's say you eat, this is going to increase your blood glucose. So your pancreas releases insulin in response. And what insulin does is it causes your body cells to take the glucose up, especially in your liver and your muscles. So we're talking about the sugar that's in your bloodstream. So your cells will absorb that sugar out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen. Now, what also happens at the same time is in the liver, we slow down or we inhibit the breakdown of stored sugars. And so we don't need to be releasing any of our stored sugars when we just ate. What we need to be doing is actually storing those sugars away. Now, your other cells in this islet of Langerhans are called alpha cells, and they release an antagonistic hormone, right? Sort of an opposite hormone called glucagon. Glucagon will raise blood glucose levels. So when you haven't eaten for a while, right? So we'll put here not eating. That means that your blood sugar will slowly decrease. And so your pancreas releases glucagon, which will raise that blood sugar back up again into that range that we're looking for, somewhere between 70 and 110. What this does is sort of the opposite thing that insulin does. It stimulates the breakdown of glycogen stores to mobilize and release glucose into your bloodstream for your tissues to use. So to run over that again, if you eat breakfast, that's going to raise blood glucose. So your pancreas should release insulin to bring blood glucose back down. Right? But when it's getting to be about noon and you're hungry and your stomach's growling, your blood glucose will be kind of low, and so your pancreas will release glucagon to bounce that glucose back up until you eat again. So here's a great picture of this. I know it kind of looks like there's a lot going on here, but it's exactly what we just talked about, right? Our goal is to have this homeostatic blood glucose level of somewhere between 70 and 110. But if you eat, right, then you might get increased blood glucose. Your pancreas releases insulin, which causes uptake of that sugar, and the blood glucose level declines back down to the range we're looking for. Now, if you haven't eaten in a while, blood glucose will be low. Pancreas releases glucagon, causes the liver to release sugar, and blood glucose levels come back up to this homeostatic range we're looking for. Now, if you've heard of insulin and or glucagon before, it's probably because of diabetes, right? So I don't expect questions about diabetes, but I just can't help myself to bring this up for a few minutes here. Diabetes, or what's technically referred to as diabetes mellitus, is a very common disease in humans that is basically leads to a malfunction of the endocrine pancreas. Might be involved, or it might involve a deficiency of insulin in the body, or it might involve a decreased response in target cells. So kind of an interesting idea, right? Maybe the body doesn't have enough insulin, or maybe the tissues that insulin should be binding to aren't responding to it. Now, whichever way you go about it, this is going to leave high levels of sugar in the bloodstream, which again can be damaging to neurons. Can also be damaging to the kidneys. It leads to increased glucose excretion, which also leads to more water excretion. So it can lead to dehydration. And one of the signs of this disease in people is that they have to urinate a whole lot. Now, if somebody has really bad, uncontrolled, or unchecked diabetes, their urine might actually start to become a little bit thick. Not as thick as honey, but a little bit thicker than just the watery excretion that we would expect. And so this is where the name comes from. Diabetes mellitus comes from two Greek words, which is diabenon, which means to pass through, and meli, which is the word for honey. So basically this disease is called honey urine, because people will tend to excrete more sugar in their urine than you should. Now, this also decreases glucose uptake by cells. Usually insulin leads to cells taking up glucose. What happens here is cells will tend to burn fats, and this forms a byproduct that can cause the blood to become a little bit acidic. And so that could be very severe and dangerous if that were to occur. There's two types of diabetes. You guys probably kind of already know this. Again, I really don't think this is going to show up on this year's exam by any means, but type 1 diabetics, it's an autoimmune disease, right? So the body attacks the beta cells and destroys them, so these people don't make enough insulin. This is often diagnosed in kids. These people are usually really thin. Type 1 diabetics and celebrities, Halle Berry's type 1 diabetic. This Jonas brother, Nick, maybe, is a type 1 diabetic. Mr. Bowman is actually type 1 diabetic, and he's a unique case because he was diagnosed pretty late in life. But he's actually type 1 diabetic as well. And then there's type 2 diabetics. Type 2 are the type who, their target tissues don't respond to insulin. This is usually the result of obesity and poor diet and lack of exercise. It's usually commonly, diagnosed in older people over 40, but they don't have to be that old. Paula Deen is a type 2 diabetic. You don't hear much about her anymore. But if you ever saw her cook back in the day, she used a lot of butter. But what's a little bit scary is that 90% of American diabetes is type 2. And so, this is why it's so important for us to, watch our diet and make sure we exercise regularly. Now, we also want to talk about the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland I want to bring up because it is not a simple endocrine pathway, but it's what we would call a complex hormonal cascade pathway. The thyroid gland is a tricky one. Right? And the reason the thyroid gland is tricky is because it involves a cascade, right? It involves multiple hormones and multiple glands for its response to occur. Now, what the thyroid does is it helps regulate metabolic activity. And your metabolic activity can change for lots of different reasons, right? It can change because of how physically active you are. It can change just simply because of the temperature of your surroundings. It can change based on the time of day, which is weird to think about. But the thyroid reacts because of this sort of trickle-down effect of a number of hormones. So let's take a look at what the thyroid does. Now, I would probably not expect the thyroid to come up on this year's AP exam in 2020. I can't say that with certainty, but I would kind of not expect it to. So if this sort of confuses you, please don't lose sleep over that. I think you'll be perfectly fine because this is a pretty complicated situation. So this is something that starts with a neuroendocrine situation. So let's say you are cold. Now, when you are cold, the goal is to increase your metabolism. You're going to do that really to generate heat more than anything else within the body. So the question becomes, how does a cold environment trigger an increase in your metabolism? So first, you got a sensory neuron. Right? Your body externally senses that it is cold out. And so that signals to the hypothalamus that we need to ramp up our metabolic activity. So the hypothalamus has these neurosecretory cells that release a neurohormone called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Now, TRH travels to another sort of neuroendocrine gland, the pituitary. And the pituitary releases TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH travels to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormones, which travel to target cells and cause a response. And in this case, those thyroid hormones go to your body tissues and cause an increase in cellular metabolism. So notice there's all these layers, right? Instead of just an endocrine tissue releases a hormone, we've got these two different kind of steps to even get to that point. TRH, TSH, and then the thyroid hormones. So to put this into words and to give you a little bit different picture here as well, a stimulus causes the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Then the pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone. And then the thyroid gland releases the thyroid hormones, which are called T3 and T4. And if you break it down, I know this is really wordy, but the names do make sense, right? Because another name for TSH is thyrotropin. So you've got thyrotropin releasing hormone, then you got thyroid stimulating hormone, and then you've got the thyroid hormones that come out. And then what this picture does a good job of showing you is that this is a negative feedback loop. So the release of T3 and T4 should feed back to the beginning and cut off release of thyroid stimulating hormone or thyrotropin releasing hormone. And don't worry about this. We did a case study in the past when we had more time, but I don't think it's applicable this year really. Now, again, just to give you a medical note really quickly, people can have too much thyroid hormone and people can have too little thyroid hormone. So if you have too much, we call that hyperthyroidism. Graves' disease is one of the types of hyperthyroidism. And this means you have a hyperactive metabolism, right? So your metabolic activity is too high. These people are usually skinny because they lose weight. They're very jittery. They're hungry all the time. They can't go to sleep because they're agitated. They might be hot all the time. They would struggle to concentrate. They're going to feel their pulse racing all the time. Blood pressure is going to be raised. And so as you can tell from that sound, it's not a very comfortable thing. And this is a reality for actually quite a few people in the United States. Now, a couple of signs. After a while, hyperthyroidism can cause some things that are very noticeable even on the exterior. One of those things is called a goiter. You notice in this lady's neck, the thyroid gland can become enlarged, and so it looks like the neck is swollen. We call that a goiter. Something else, and this is a really extreme case here, but something else is called exophthalmos. Increased thyroid hormones, right? So high T3 and T4 actually lead to increased fat in the orbits, or sort of like those spaces where your eyeballs sit. So if you have hyperthyroidism, over time it can lead to this protrusion of the eyes. And this is a creepy picture, I know, but basically it means that the eyeballs kind of bulge out of the head. And it sounds weird, but if you were, in medical practice, it would jump out at you. And if you're like me then, who had some training in medicine, then you go through your life and you notice these things in people, right? You notice someone who might look kind of like they have a goiter, or you notice somebody who's exophthalmic and you wonder if they have thyroid issues. The other side of the coin, right, the opposite is hypothyroidism, and this also happens. This is a little less common than hyperthyroidism, but this is where the metabolism is not as active as it should be, and so it's almost the opposite, right? People will gain weight, but they won't be hungry. They're going to feel cold all the time. They're going to feel lazy all the time. They're going to have really low blood pressure, and they're going to have a slow pulse. They'll also have trouble concentrating, but it's just the exact opposite. It's not enough thyroid hormone. So this basically concludes our endocrine talk. I thought this was a good meme here. Probably a lot like our AP biology class sometimes. 2 minutes of class left. Oh, looks like I'll have to rush through this last concept that you have to know. So let's say that happens, right? This is a very real world, for you guys, stressful situation. So the question becomes, what does your body do inside from a physiological standpoint when you're faced with something like this? Now, when this happens, you have both communication systems of your body stimulated, the endocrine system and the nervous system. And for them to function, they have to have each other, right? A stress response to that teacher on the last slide involves epinephrine release, but it also depends on nervous system detection and nervous system communication. You're going to get a neurohormone release from your brain that leads to the release of epinephrine. And then you're going to get all these things happen. You're going to get an increase in blood sugar that we mentioned, released from your liver. You're also going to increase your breathing rate. We hadn't mentioned that one yet. You're going to get an increase in heart rate, an increase in your metabolism, those changes in blood flow that we mentioned. Your muscles are going to tense. Your eyes are actually going to dilate to let more light in so you can see better. And so what we need to move on to now is, how does the nervous system contribute to all of this sort of stuff and also play a big role in cellular communication?